Yes, well, thank you. Thank you, Daniel, and good evening, everyone. As Daniel says, I'm John Carroll in the history department. So it's always a pleasure to introduce a guest speaker, and it's even more of a pleasure when the speaker happens to be a former student from one's own department. Chris Cowell did his PhD at Hong Kong U under the primary supervision of Dr. Peter Koenig, but I was fortunate enough to serve as his secondary supervisor. And Chris not only wrote one of the best MPhil theses I've ever read, he also wrote one of the biggest and longest MPhil theses I've ever read. Chris, I don't know how well you remember this, but I'm going to put it here side by side with this beautiful new book, and you will see exactly what I am talking about here. But again, it was one of the best that I've read, and it was also one of the longest. I should reverse that. It was one of the longest, but one of the best. Chris, after leaving Hong Kong U, went to Columbia University, where he did his PhD in architecture. He then taught at Trinity College Dublin, and he is now back in London at London South Bank University, where he teaches architectural history and theory. Chris, I think the best way to describe what he does is he works at the intersection of architecture and imperialism, especially in South China and in India. And of course, as everybody knows, that's why you're here today. His MPhil thesis has now become a book with Chinese University of Hong Kong Press. And that's what he's going to talk about today. I just want to mention to everybody that it is beautifully written, as his thesis was. And this one is also beautifully illustrated. And I believe if you order soon, you get a discount too. I can't remember if it's, is it 20%, Chris?
Yeah, I think you'll have to twist their arm because I think the deadline's over, but it was 20%. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we can work on that with our friends from Chinese.
Yeah, just let me know.
Sure. Yes.
Or just let them know that I told them to give you a discount.
Exactly. There we
Yes.
go. There we go. And I have to apologize in advance because unfortunately I'm going to have to leave in a few minutes for a meeting, and I really do look forward to watching and listening to this when it is recorded. But in the meantime, Chris, welcome back to Hong Kong U, and congratulations on your new book.
Thank you, John. That means a lot to me. Thank you so much. That's great. I know you have to dash, but I wanted to just say thank you so much for your mentorship, because you were a newbie at Hong Kong U when I started this. You were also just as new as me, and we were learning the ropes together. And you took me under your wing and took me to the Hong Kong Public Records Office and showed me how things worked and things like that. So I have fond memories of that journey. So thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for that very kind opening. And I think I'll share the screen with you all and see how it goes. If that works, tell me if it works or not. Is that working? Okay. Have I got the right one? Can you see the screen? Can everyone see the images? Okay, and I hope I've got the right slides because I've got several versions I've been formulating. But anyway, I have to click OK. All these little weird things floating around, but hopefully that doesn't bother you. I wonder if I can reduce that. Okay, good. I haven't got my notes. They were on the slides. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk through some of the images as a sort of visual crutch. That's often how I teach anyway. I'm a very visual person, and I rely on this a lot to help me think. But I also use, as you may see during the course of these conversations, that the image means a lot to how I formulate my thoughts as well, and how I write. And I use the image as an active interlocutor and not just as something to illustrate a point. I'll just start off hovering on this book cover because this image, a very elusive image, is from an anonymous Chinese painter, painted in 1843. And I think there's maybe a better image, the next one. Here it is now unfolded, if you like, across the book cover. And I wanted to just show that how Hong Kong was imagined turns out to be just as important as how Hong Kong was actually constructed. And I use the word construction, to have a double meaning in the subtitle. Of course, form follows fever. is a play on words. It comes from those of you who have some architectural background. You'll know that the phrase "form follows function" became a credo of the modernist movement, coined by Louis Sullivan in the 1890s. And what that meant was that the form of any building or any work came out of its functional application. The function told you how it should look. Now, in many ways, that was a misnomer. But in here, I literally think that the fever of Hong Kong, this strange gaseous miasma, which they called malaria, bad air, malus aria. So it's malaria as gas, comes about through actually actively shaped the form of the city, but not just from the point of view that a disease as an agent acts upon how they react, but it also acts upon how they imagine the city as a dangerous surface, a landscape, a terrain that had foreboding, that contained the very particles of their destruction. So one of the strange things about Hong Kong was, as they were building Hong Kong on the surface, on the northern edge of Hong Kong Island, the very landscape held tremendous doubts for them as they were constructing and forming it. And so they would react and respond to what they saw as a test, a laboratory. The surface was a laboratory. And year upon year, as people died in certain areas of the city, they would react accordingly and refine what they understood to be the shape and nature of the city. But it wasn't just that. The politics of space played a very important role too, in the way that the city was fought over and various areas of the city were considered. Now, in this particular painting, painted in the very year of a very bad outbreak, the worst outbreak of malaria in the 1840s, 1843, called the Hong Kong fever, we see here a landscape which is very sort of strange and foreboding, with these exaggerated hills, very dark, brooding mountains, a sort of bilish green, I call it, of the mountainside in the foreground, a sort of moldy like blue in the distance, and a sort of jaundiced sky above, with obviously the houses sort of naively drawn in different wrong scales, varying scales. But nevertheless, it's a very powerful, if you like, impression of an inner psyche, perhaps, of what Hong Kong was becoming. And notice we see, even though they're not necessarily shown on some of the maps, we see a lot of construction climbing quite high up the hillsides here in such an early stage. Sometimes the paintings reveal an urbanism that, in fact, the official maps don't reveal. So anyway, notice also the use of building on the ridges of the hillside, which becomes a common idea of safety compared to the ravines, where the nullahs, the rivers, run through. So we have a terrain which is carefully thought about as they are building Hong Kong. So I'll read a bit of the blurb and explain the sequence. So Form Follows Fever, as the dust cover says, is the first in-depth account of the turbulent early years of settlement and growth of colonial Hong Kong across the 1840s. During this period, the island gained a terrible reputation as a diseased and deadly location. Malaria, then perceived as a mysterious vapor or miasma, intermittently carried off settlers by the hundreds. Various attempts to arrest its effects acted as a catalyst, reconfiguring both the city's physical and political landscape, though not necessarily for the better. Now, caught in a frenzy to rebuild the city in a devastating aftermath, the book charts the complex interplay between a cast of figures, from military surveyors, naval doctors, Indian sepoys, and corrupt and paranoid officials, to opium traders, arsonists, Chinese contractors, and sojourner architects and artists. However, Hong Kong's construction was not just physical, but also imagined. Architecture, cartography, epidemiology, and urban infrastructure offer a critical forensic lens through which to examine the shifting ideologies of public health and space race and placemaking, and commerce and politics, all set against the radical alteration of the settlement from shore hugging to climbing city in response to miasma theory, a pre-bacteriological belief in gaseous emanations from a sickly environment. Now, the other third paragraph in this dust cover blurb explains the kinds of sources that I use. And so I say that this kaleidoscopic study draws upon many unpublished textual sources, including medical reports, personal diaries and letters, government records, journal accounts, newspaper articles, and advertisements. And as this history is set a decade before the introduction of photography to the colony, the book relies upon a variety of alternate visual evidence, from previously lost watercolor illustrations of the city to maps and plans and drawings that individually and in combination provide trace material enabling the reconstruction of this strange and rapidly evolving society. Form Follows Fever sheds new light on a period often considered the colonial dark ages in the territory's history. So I hope that's enough to say about the opening. And of course, at the back of the book, there's this large pullout, so no extra cost. And it is an image that I took of the 1843 survey map, the property map, known as the Gordon's map, but I think should probably be called the Edwards de Havilland survey, that shows that all the various parts of the city as they're being unfolded in different zones, looking at where the major focal points are along the northern edge of the island. And we already see that in the now what we call the Central District, then it was called the Western District, that a growing urbanism is starting to take place. And we see that the city is in certain kinds of pockets along the edge of the city and with gaps in between. And we'll see that these divisions between the areas of the city just increase with the fear of malaria and the politics of space being played out between government officials, military personnel, merchants and Chinese settlers. So they're four real constituents combating each other for terrain here on this shown on this map. Now, in the study, there are no photographs, as I say, except for one, which I preserve for the very front of the book. And the reason I do that is just to juxtapose Hong Kong as it would have been seen by about 1870 with Hong Kong as it was then understood in the history that I uncover. Now, as I say, no one's written really an in-depth study of the sort of founding colonialization of colony of Hong Kong, which is kind of surprising. I was very surprised when I was working on this, and I suppose part of it is because it had to involve a lot of primary source digging. We've relied on historians writing from other historical sources, secondary sources. Many historians have known about how malaria had a dramatic effect upon the shape of Hong Kong, but perhaps not as significant as I'm trying to argue here. The other thing is I find it fascinating to start to consider how does one write about a colony from primary sources when there's so many different kinds of registers and in ways to write about. How does one assemble a jigsaw of parts in describing a city notionally, fantastically considered to have sprung from scratch? Now, of course, nothing is from scratch, but this is part of the kind of mythology of Hong Kong, the city of Hong Kong, which was called Victoria at the time. So we see here on the northern shore of what becomes Davao Road, a very, very elegant city with buildings of similar heights, of arcades, of a very tame and designed waterfront, carefully considered, very different from the kind of city that we discover early on. In the introduction, I start to talk about and tease out the idea of what this notion of malaria was. What was miasma theory? What was miasma? And medical theory plays a very important part in this story. Now, this image is Francis Danby's The Upas or Poison Tree in the island of Java, painted in 1820 for his induction to the Royal Academy. But we see here this sort of blighted landscape, a fantastical landscape with this solitary spike, these Europeans, white Europeans dying, killed by the noxious gases contained in this valley from this poison tree. Now, it's almost like a sort of a biblical scene. And in fact, there were many such paintings of biblical and the wrath of God being painted at this time in England. But this, in fact, as I found out, was not just considered fantastical, but really thought to exist. And in the worst points of Hong Kong's sickness, they in fact published an article on the poison tree of Java and talked about how it really existed and was really killing people. And so you can see from this little clue, this little hint, how Hong Kong people were very attuned to landscapes of devastation, landscapes that seem to be naturally hostile to them. And part of the great debate of the development of this story of the setting up of Hong Kong was the sense of precarity as to whether it was intrinsic to the landscape that nature was in fact the enemy of the settlers as they were building, that it was a fatal island, an island that would kill them eventually, that there was no chance of survival, as one Robert Montgomery Martin thought, the first colonial treasurer of Hong Kong in 1845, or whether one could mitigate and protect people through the development and the building of Hong Kong itself and through the reforestation of Hong Kong, the planting of trees. And this debate, the second form, won over. And in fact, the development of Hong Kong is a story of both tragedy in the early stages of the 1840s and triumph in the second half of the 1840s. Of course, malaria never goes away, but it gets reconditioned, reabsorbed, reimagined, tamed, if you like. And I show this through developments of cartography and maps and medical reports and various ways of viewing the city as it's built. So here we see, for example, how maps start to form an important role in this story. The cartography of Hong Kong reveals certain clues as to the psyche of people and their relationship to terrain. In this map, which is taken from the Surveyor General's office, we see a billeting map, which means it's a map designed for the housing, the temporary housing of troops in other people's dwellings during, say, the cold winter season. In this billeting map, we get the sense of an exaggerated and a strong landscape intervening at the shoreline of the city through these etchings and hatchings, where clearly dwellings are built upon the top ridges of the island and the valley portions where the rivers, the water systems, the nulla, as they're called, flow down, are considered where the miasmas linger, where the gaseous emanations come from. One of the things that I think is very interesting is we might feel that doctors, these medical theorists of the mid-19th century, may be rather naive because they don't have the correct paradigm. They don't understand bacteriology, epidemiology, germ theory at this point. But I would caution that point of view by saying that they were very, very astute in understanding through empirical observation what caused miasma, where it lingered, what to mitigate, to protect oneself against. And so medical theory had a degree of sophistication in understanding landscape, in understanding construction, in understanding geology, in understanding climate studies, many of these doctors were trained in many areas of research because they understood it to be external to the body, disease, and not internal. And therefore, the built environment, the natural environment, landscape, ecology was part of the toolkit, if you like, of a practicing doctor of the time. And so we need to pay attention to their a degree of sophistication in which they considered disease. I show this as a sort of pun for Hong Kong students and staff, just to show. In fact, this was an image I showed many years back. I was giving a talk on the early MPhil work that I'd been doing that led to this book, and in very much so that the very room in which we sat, I declared rather triumphantly, with Schadenfreude perhaps, that the courtyard and the room we were sat in was the very starting point of the 1843 Hong Kong fever, because we think it started at West Point Barracks, which sits on a line, as you see on the right-hand side, from 3rd Street right up to the main building, into the main building, in which the poor soldiers were dying of this sickness. They couldn't understand what was causing it. And then it soon spread across the island. So part of the story is to wonder how the movements of humans, particularly the movements of human vectors such as the army, and as they move through different areas of the China coast in the Anglo-Chinese War, the first Anglo-Chinese War, often known as the First Opium War, how they would bring in, how one could determine if the island was intrinsically malarial or that malaria was an import. And I argue from evidence that it was imported, in fact, and that the myth that Hong Kong Island was inherently dangerous was something that they added onto it. But we see here this idea of Hong Kong Island starts to develop itself as a language, as a graphic language. And one of the earliest maps we have, European maps we have, is of Alexander Dalrymple's from the 1760s, later published somewhat later. But we can see here how the very important, most important part of the island for the British when they were settling, which is the deep water bay, now known as Victoria Harbour, was not yet known, discovered, or measured by hydrographers of the Royal Navy in the late 18th century, until in fact, Dalrymple does do a further tour of the island somewhat later, I think in the 1790s, and does discover and measure the soundings of Victoria Harbour. So by the 1800s, Hong Kong Island was known and shaped quite emphatically and clearly. And we see here in Daniel Ross and Philip Morn's study of 1810, that they had discovered indeed the importance of the northern edge of Hong Kong as a typhoon shelter, as a dumping ground, and for some decades it was used as an illegal opium dumping ground for the British. So when the British did eventually take Hong Kong through the unequal Treaty of Junpui in 1841, they already had their eye on this patch of land on the northern edge of Hong Kong. And of course, before that, they were taking their water from the waterfall, which is obviously still there on the southwest side of Hong Kong Island, near Ap Lei Jiao, and they were in Hong Kong Zai and that area where the name Hong Kong actually came from, and the island was obviously mistakenly labeled. We see here, of course, that mistaken phonetic understanding or audible understanding of the island as they asked the Cantonese, "Where are we?" They actually said Hong Kong, but they thought it meant Red River. And we see here the misunderstanding written down by a Chinese calligrapher elsewhere when they're asked to illustrate the map. But this is the first proper survey of Hong Kong Island and the edges of the island by Captain Belcher and his ship in 1841, and this map becomes a very important template and keeps getting added to as the island is developed. But look again at this cartography, look again at how this map is drawn, where we see this sort of almost lunar surface where the terrain seems a very pockmarked. I'm not going to go in as far as saying it's a diseased kind of map. It's just a graphic that they're using, but it is to emphasize that the heights and declivities are an important feature to distinguish by map makers at this time. And I will, and in the book I show contour lines and how the contour starts to tame the map. The first ever contour map is by Thomas Bernard Collinson. It's in fact, Hong Kong is the first ever published map of contour lines in the world, and 1845, and it starts to flatten and tame and make empirical this mountainous vertiginous island. So the book is set up into 5 main chapters. Here are the different chapters and how they're arranged, and they are the debate was to wonder whether it should be chronological or thematic, and in fact, as a common debate among for a historian, but it seemed to me that this monograph, this study, this close study over just 10 years required a sort of blow-by-blow account, and that in fact, one could have it both ways. One could both be thematic and chronological. And as you can see with the development of the chapters, that the island reclaimed is the idea of the island being this so-called blank slate, and what do you do when you import things on the island. And so the first chapter is really about a sort of fantastical idea of the importation of elements to create a Hong Kong on a surface that is a given, and this negotiation and the problems between landscape and built form. In this town redrawn, I start to focus on the seismic crisis of malaria, suddenly a stone thrown into the development of the colony, and how they start to scrabble for evidence and argument as to what on earth this disease is and how is it emanating and how can they protect themselves from it in various ways. And so it's a sudden shake-up of the board, and all the pieces of this urbanism are thrown up in the air and fall down in a different direction. So Hong Kong literally has, in 1844, gets redrafted in a very dramatic sense through eminent domain purchases. And of course, the particular victims are the Chinese. In the second, the third and fourth chapters form a tie in terms of periodicity. And I start to look at this as a part 1 and part 2 approach, in where Hong Kong starts to pick back up and starts to rebuild. And how does it get rebuilt? And the first chapter really looks at the physical construction and the negotiation of construction with Chinese and European overseers, something that hasn't really been looked at before, and the predominant use of pidgin English in this negotiation, also in the taming of Hong Kong and the idea of infrastructure, how infrastructure starts to be seen as an essential component to protect them long-term from malaria, particularly the drainage and sewers. And in the second portion, City Remade, there's the ideological threats imposed upon Hong Kong as it gets rebuilt, and the ideological concepts of a city visually. So from Robert Montgomery Martin, an important figure who nearly pulls the plug on Hong Kong, nearly causes the Colonial Office to demand that Hong Kong stops as a project, which is very surprising. It was a discovery of mine. I don't think anyone knew this before. And then the idea of a language of architecture from the so-called indigenous architecture of mat shed construction, which is still in use today, to the development of mansions, warehouse, go-down mansions, which the great Hongs, the opium-dealing Hongs like Dent & Co. and Jardine Matheson & Co. start to build as a template of living, because they're seen to be the great leaders in creating healthy architecture. And then the final chapter really looks at how Hong Kong, how a miniature crisis in 1848 within the most proudly displayed and opulently built military government buildings on the island ironically become the locus of a reenactment of malaria. But now all of the tools that they've learnt from a landscape of fear is collapsed into rooms of a building. And so I felt that this discovery of these documents became a very good coda to consolidate the ending of this decade, in which they then I end by looking at how they start to expand their interests and start to illegally encamp and explore Kowloon on the opposite side, foreshadowing, if you like, the Second Opium War of 1860. So that's the kind of storyline that I'm showing. I'm not going to go too much into this, but I just wanted to show you some of the drawings and illustrations. This is the very, very first image we have of Hong Kong from the side. John Collins' study, probably taken a day or two after the flag was planted, which kind of shows you where the island, how the island is, the first terrain is set out. Surprisingly, it's not where we think it is. It's in fact rough in Sheungwan, and it's probably closer to Taiping Shan area. But we see that the reason that they go for these is very pragmatic. The army tents are placed close to a source of water, a stream, and we see this in a rare iteration of Belcher's 1841 map on the right. Now, in fact, this version of Belcher's map, I've never seen except online. It's really hard to see. It doesn't exist in any of the archives I've been to. I've never seen it in person, but it exists here. I didn't put this red line around it. This was drawn by whoever took this image. But we can see here how the lines, the army lines of tents are laid out on the right. If I can have my cursor here. And then we see the very earliest road built by the engineers, it says, is starting. So this very, very first road is extended from the army tents eastwards. And it's in the eastern areas that they find level ground, and that's where they decide to settle. And here, a few days after that, we see that the army has now moved across to an area which we now call Admiralty, Kamjong, but in fact, it was known as Cantonment Hill. That became the center of the first colony. And we see here, there's the cluster at the base of Admiralty, now we call it, and this is where Hong Kong Park is. This is where the first hill above it is, and then the government is on the other side of the nullah. But we see here, this is the very first settlement. So I use visual evidence to really look at the psyche of landscape. I'm very interested in how people felt about living in Hong Kong as much as how they constructed it. So constructed it in their heads, as well as constructed it in real terms, and how they assembled the parts. What parts are needed, in fact, to build a city? And that's an interesting question, at least a reassuring city for those that are trying to do this experiment. We see this is the very first image we have of the island looking back to the water by Edward Cree, a young naval surgeon in the Royal Navy. He comes back regularly to Hong Kong, and this is his view of the island in one of his very first visits to the island. But we see that the island is the urbanism at the very beginning of Hong Kong is a strange one of two parts. We have, of course, all the hucksters' stalls and cellars and the tents. It's like a big marketplace. It's like, Chinese New Year market in Victoria Park, shall we say. It's all there on the front of the shoreline with the flags fluttering. But no one's living on Hong Kong Island at this point. Everyone is living on boats or on the other side, on the mainland. And so the real urbanism, the real domestic, if you like, urbanism of Hong Kong are these black beetle-like boats floating in the water. And that water-based urbanism persists for some time across the first year or two of Hong Kong until people start to move and physically build and start to live on the island, particularly the Europeans. The very first map we have of Hong Kong in terms of a study, a governmental study map, is the so-called Pottinger's map of 1842. This is it rolled out, and we see it from the National Archives at Kew. in London, and look how it betrays an orientation. It is orientated from north to south. So northwards is the other way around. And why this peculiar orientation? Because they were living on boats. They were looking at the island from the other direction, and therefore the correct orientation, as the government imagined it, was from the water looking upwards to the island. And so we can get clues as to the psyche of land from the way it's drawn, the way it's represented, the way it's mapped, and so forth. And obviously these color codes represent different constituents on the island, the government in red, and private property and military in brown, and so forth. On the right, we see here this upper bazaar, lower right, which becomes the very first major designed street, if you like, even though it's going against the Queen's Road carriageway. It's two parallel roads of Chinese shop houses going up the hill, and is remarked upon by European commentators in very favorable terms compared to what they considered to be rather a sort of terrible, awfully designed stuff by the government, and poor classicism elsewhere. And so we see a sort of complex idea of a sort of, you could almost say, a racialized or racist understanding of architecture from the point of view of saying, well, Chinese contractors can't build European very well, but they're very good at building their own, so stick to that. But at the same time, it becomes a sort of attack on government as well, saying, well, the government officials show that they're barbaric and lack taste in how they build. And so I also look at how, the language, particularly of news broadsheets, and how the debates are going on in terms of how architecture is being portrayed and visualized and conceived of. We see here markets very carefully being placed in these ravines, in the dangerous malarial areas of Hong Kong, because they're not going to be lived in permanently. They're just going to be there for shopping. And so in this one on the left, the Morgan's Bazaar, we see it here in this big declivity, in other words, a brownfield site, you might call it today. It's an area that's not very in demand to be sold or developed because of the, if you like, the pathology of terrain suggests that these declivities are not wholesome. And so the markets start to inhabit these declivities, these little fissures between the nullahs and in these little pocket valleys. And you can see the valley in Morgan's Bar going upwards behind it. There, we see another view of these, another bazaar, a competing bazaar further down the road, the Canton Bazaar, another rare view. And we start to see a language of Hong Kong from the Chinese perspective being built. They tend to be timber. They're known as Singapore frame construction. They're shop houses with brick or granite bases, but obviously timber framed construction. And they become the first arcades of Hong Kong as well. And then, of course, later reproduced in granite. And so we go on with various other topographies. This particular artist, Edward Ashworth, was a very important figure in the book. And he was discovered, his work was rediscovered around 2014 by a collector in Sydney, who then got in touch with me, and I helped determine the provenance of these new pieces. This is not one of them. This is from the New Zealand Library, but there are others. The two market buildings that I showed you are part of that new discovery. And I wrote a catalogue for this, and on the back of that, I was pleased to see that the Hong Kong Museum of Art purchased all of the images for the Hong Kong people. But Ashworth was an architect from Devon who taught the children of the first governor of New Zealand and lived in New Zealand, but he came over via Australia to land in Hong Kong in 1844, where he saw the first major building boom and was involved in it. And he takes some meticulous drawings and studies of Hong Kong from an architect's point of view. So while these are not great works of art, say like a George Chinnery, they're very revealing works of art from a point of view of an urbanist, a person who understands the city and understands construction, and quite evocative in their own way. Other kinds of painters, and here we have an anonymous painter, Chinese painter, painting for his patron, who would have been James Matheson or Alexander Matheson, of the East Point One, which is now Causeway Bay, and the peninsula coming out, jutting out into the sea. And we see here how the terrain of fear starts to cause merchants to live at high level. Although East Point One, it can be argued, was conceived of before the real outbreak, it was seen as a litmus test. Oddly enough, Happy Valley, or Wong Nai Chong, which is just to the bottom of this painting, was a terrible site of malarial attack in 1843. But strangely, East Point One, which sat just above it, which is now the Lee Gardens in Causeway Bay, was quite immune from it. And people started to wonder how such close proximity led also to very different outcomes. And this started to become the idea of height starts to become a great idea of the city. And we see the distinction between height here and declivity. And so we have this kind of terrain, pathology of fear starts to take over. And I'm just going to end here, by the way, because we want to have time for talks, but I wanted to just end by explaining that the interior worlds of Hong Kong were just as important to me to decode as the exterior, and how that Hong Kong, how the interiors, which are rare finds to find images of the interior, starts to reveal ideas of domesticity, of familiarity against non-familiarity, the ideas of reacting obviously to the climate. We see here the inside of Collinson's bungalow, letter G, it was known as. And in it, I'll just read a little passage from this, if I can find it. Yes. So Collinson, by the time the young Royal Engineer and Surveyor Lieutenant Thomas Bernard Collinson arrived on the island in late 1843, army officers were living in dry and secure civilian lodgings billeted out to them. Despite this, the Hong Kongian interior lifestyle, they were known as Hong Kongian by one writer, to have this eclectic melange of pieces in their interiors. Obviously, these are European. Despite this, the Hong Kongian interior lifestyle with its eclectic features lingered on. In a letter to his mother dated November 1845, Collinson charmingly captured his own domestic interior in an enclosed sketch to allay her maternal fears. Da Costa and I, he said, are still living together in Grant's bungalow, which is known in official documents by the title of Letter G. You had the view from it and of it, and now there is a view in it. Collinson, known as Bernard or Burr to his family, plundered some of his naval brother's possessions to deck out his accommodation. He quotes, "I ransacked Dick's drawers to furnish it handsomely, but I am afraid it will disappoint some of the children if they have been reading Aladdin lately." End quote. For instead of an excitedly expected Oriental interior, he drew for his family one of a recognizable European features: a long, high-ceilinged space with several glazed windows along one length, and at one end frames the ridges of the town beyond. The room is sparsely filled with elegant furniture. A light woven cane recliner or chaise longue, the only object betraying the subtropical climate, lies by a cloth-covered table in the centre, strewn with books. A writer's bureau sits by the window near the end. A Roman-style padded armchair and a low sofa to the left frame the doorway to a room beyond. A Doric pilastered stove and mantelpiece can be seen on the far left, and to the right, far right, a table of knickknacks described as the museum, as you may see by the bits of coral that hide half of Otterburn Tower. Apart from the medieval Northumberland Tower, a number of other framed paintings girdle the walls over windows and furniture, like postcard mementos of distant visits, all probably the handiwork of Collinson himself. For officers, at least, living standards had improved dramatically since 1841. Okay, and compare this to one more image, which was taken somewhat later, and this is by Edward Cree, if I can find that image, which I think is an important one to show the exaggerated sense of fear that Europeans were living in. So Cree, let me just get this right. Perhaps sensing the stretched and weak police security on the island by opportunists, a spate of audacious domestic robberies took place over this period. These affairs, wrote Edward Cree, are constantly occurring at Hong Kong, where the Chinese are most expert and daring robbers. As an example, Cree records in his diary for early March a meeting he had with his friend Mrs. Alderman White and her distressed ward, Miss Mary Ann Lafoy. To quote, Monday, 4th of March, 1844, called on Mrs. Alderman White, whose house has been broken into by a party of Chinese robbers. She gave a graphic description of the affair, and Miss Lafoy added she had 50 Chinamen in her bedroom, and she jumped out of bed and without dressing ran down to the 41st Army's quarters to fetch up the guard. But before she got back, the robbers had decamped. End quote. So apparently graphic was the scene described by the woman that for the young naval surgeon, it seemed to excitedly paint itself in his diary. The room hurriedly drawn in confused perspective. For him, it is a scene full of racialized and sexualized theatricality, set as if on stage. Brown, shirtless, snarling men are packed into the foreground. The pale ward clutches her diaphanous nightdress to her bosom as she leaps from the four-poster bed and through its netting towards the door, stage left. Evidently, Cree knew the house's layout sufficient to show that Miss Lafoy lived on the upper floor, her room facing a balcony. His illustration of the furniture and accoutrements within the room may or may not have been fantasized, but they are a convincing depiction of the interior of a mid-1840s European's bedroom on the island. The 50 Chinamen is an evident exaggeration. Even Cree could not accommodate it to fit within the reimagined drama. To quote, Mrs. White did not lose much by the Chinese plunderers, some clothes and nothing of much value. Poor Mary Ann lost the clothes she was going to put on, but they had a great fright. Okay, I'll end it there and open it up to the group. Thank you very much. Let's stop the share. Okay.
Thank you very much, Chris. This was fantastic. The images are beautiful, and the way you talk through them is fantastic. So I think without kind of anything in between, I'll just go ahead and pass it on to Jenny and Lory to grad students who have prepared an excellent response and questions to open up a conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing your fascinating story about the origins of Hong Kong's urban landscape with us, Chris. I really enjoyed reading about it. Through meticulous research, you uncover the largely overlooked exploitation of the Chinese population and the crucial contributions made by Chinese labor in establishing Hong Kong as a prosperous finance center we know today. Your narrative includes these contributions through some touching and valuable stories exploring the lives of some of the Chinese during this transformative period. Additionally, you write about the interesting hybrid culture that emerged through the collaboration between the Chinese and the British in the construction process, including unique architectural styles and construction techniques. My PhD looks at representations of the 1894 plague in Hong Kong and aims to challenge the prevailing whitewash narratives of the city and prejudiced notions of Chinese bodies and spaces as disease, through, for example, exploring the colonial government's role in enabling the plague outbreak. More specifically, I highlight the poor state of the public sanitary and sewage infrastructure in the Chinese living quarters, as well as the whole of the city more broadly. As we know, prevailing narratives of Hong Kong often glorify the colonial government's perceived benevolence towards the natives, while downplaying the significant role played by Chinese in the shaping of the city. So I'm curious to know whether you purposely wrote your book with the intention of questioning and reshaping these dominant narratives. I also would like to know about the process involved in crafting this type of fresh perspective of Hong Kong history. How do you make the government archival documents speak against its best interests, and how do you account for voices that could not be heard? Thank you.
Thank you, Lory. That's a great question. My approach actually might sound a bit weird. I don't go out of it to, although of course I suppose the best way of saying it is there's subaltern methods, there's subaltern tactics involved in how to do this. But I think most important thing of all is give it some time and constantly listen to the materials and get a wide divergence of materials. Now, one of the structural problems of writing this book in this time period is the fact that there is a dearth of Chinese textual material. In other words, there's not much of it, very little, in fact, for the first 10 years of the settlement. And I mentioned this in the introduction. There wasn't even a Chinese newspaper until the 1850s, a missionary newspaper in the London Missionary Society. There was Chinese advertisements for building. There was also instructions from government from the Chinese. But in terms of and there may be scholars who can find more evidence to either augment or even counter what I've written. But I would say that one of the things that I've tried to do very strongly is to try to understand how to read things like strike actions, unionization of contractors, the snippets we have from, say, Ashworth in Pidgin English conversations with contractors is very revealing. The way that Chinese consolidated and grouped themselves socially. And so there's moments of pushback, there's moments of alliance. And in fact, what we get also is misunderstandings of Chinese construction, in the blaming of them for collapsing buildings is one example where, they're caused to build a very high in a language, a constructional tectonic language that's maybe not suited for that. There's clearly from a survey of Johnson's house, the misalignment of windows and all this, I would argue, is not necessarily attack on, it's not necessarily the blame of the Chinese. It could well be that there was an unsupervised requirement to build so many windows, and perhaps the contractor was just terrible, because we have examples of wonderful contractors like Tama Choi, who build in a very exquisite Regency form of construction, although in terms of detailing, there's not like Corinthian capitals. The British claim is not exactly correct compared to the wonderful plasterwork inside. And George cleverly, when he does his analysis and report, says he reassures his Europeans by saying, well, it's an English plasterer that did the work inside. But we nevertheless get very competent architecture by the major Chinese contractors. And I would say it just reveals, like the same with anywhere else, we have good contractors and bad contractors, and they happen to be Chinese. So in both categories. So I wanted to just blow apart that idea. The idea of hybridized languages, for me, was a very important thing to understand, because from the very beginning, Hong Kong is an imported language. The question really is who is importing what, how, where from, in what manner, and for what purpose. And so this concept of importation, including botanical importation, including constructional importation, including concepts of the language of urbanism, in professional importation, who could come in, who could not come in to the island, and so forth. All of this had to be untangled, if you like. So in a way, Lory, one of the issues I had is the fact that it's how does one untangle this whole complexity of evidence from all sorts of areas and put them into registers that are discrete but talk to each other? And of course, they're artificial registers because I'm the author separating them out, but I also want them to be organic registers that interconnect and have life, and aren't sort of teased out just for the sake of doing it, but they're teased out with the understanding that that's how the people, the agents in the history, were teasing them out themselves. So in other words, listening to their own conception of the island and making categories as I felt they were making those categories, not me. So of course, there's a degree of artifice. I am making categories for sure, but I've tried very much to listen to viewpoints and evidence as I was discovering it. And so if you like, the theoretical underpinnings of the book are in a sort of grounded theory, where I'm trying very hard to let the theory percolate out of the evidence. An old school approach, you could say, for historians to do that. So there, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I found your response extremely informative. I think, yeah, it's such a challenge to kind of listen to the materials, especially when so much of it in the government archives glorify the colonial government. So I totally empathize with you, with the need to look at a wide variety of materials and then to kind of, like you said, put them together as a jigsaw and present them in a coherent form, which you did very well in your book. So I also have a question, which would kind of challenge this dominant whitewashed colonial narrative of Hong Kong. And my question is this: might this crafting of Hong Kong's urban landscape in 1844 to 1849, might this have triggered some kind of environmental disasters which would not have otherwise occurred if this whole restructuring of Hong Kong didn't happen? And I ask this because I know for a fact that the colonial government forced the Chinese to squeeze into Taiping San in 1844, and I look at this episode and I say, this overcrowding is what enabled the later plague outbreak. So I was wondering what your views on this is.
Wow. I don't know if Cecilia Chu's listening, but she could also offer an insight into this question from her work on this. But I think that, yeah, I actually, yeah, the 1844, the destruction of the Upper Bazaar and moving people forcibly into Taiping San later, and in this congested form, certainly there's a poignancy in that historical echo, the future of 1894 and the bubonic plague. Yes, absolutely. I was very aware of this, and I mentioned it in the conclusion. In fact, I'm very aware of this sequence of this sad sequence. If anything, the tragedy of it is, of course, that the Chinese are relatively powerless at this point in terms of negotiation of political space. And the reason they're powerless, partly, and by the 1870s, they're not as powerless. The reason they're powerless is they don't have the class structure, and the wealth hasn't accrued yet in terms of a bargaining through a material and acquisitive power. The British, it becomes much more difficult to the British to start to push them around, so to speak, decades later, because the politics of space has become much more complex and variegated. But at this point in time, this very early point in time, there's an almost cartoonish bluntness to the divisions of space based upon very poorly drawn maps, you could say. But it isn't so much the maps that are dictating boundaries and zones, I feel, as so much as the topography on the ground. In other words, the legibility of these very, very stark spines of land falling precipitously into the water starts to demarcate politics of space quite sharply. We have, for example, the Cantonment Hill, which is where the military sit. And then we have the Albany Nullah, as it was called, and then a big division. And then we have Government Hill, which is the other next spine, and another nullah. And then we have Magistracy Hill, which is where the Upper Bazaar sits, near where the Upper Bazaar, and that's another spine. And then another valley, and then, of course, the Upper Bazaar. And then further along, we have down the Lower Bazaar, against which Taiping San links to it later. And so we get this undulating landscape, very, very severe, in a way that most Hong Kongers have no understanding of, because those valleys have now been filled in and flattened and terraced. And so we haven't got that sense of this vertical dividing line that was very strong at the very beginning of the settlement of Hong Kong. So how down at the front of the shoreline, the Queen's Road was easy enough to do, even though a lot of the land fell straight down into the water for about 10 feet. they were able to reclaim the land quite quickly and creating the road. But as you climbed upwards, the land would undulate so severely that it would naturally form enclaves separate from each other. And the other thing is, that's why geography is very important to understand in this study, a very cold-nosed, cold-eyed geography, understanding how the terrain worked. Because no matter how much we can read allegorically into this, or even from a comp lit point of view, you can't escape the geography. And so I would say it is there, right? And so let's be blunt about that empirical aspect, overlaid with all the fantastical aspects. But in front of that, we also have this idea of reclamation that haunts the project of Hong Kong to a disastrous level, I would say, today. And that is the construction of the roads, the very first roads, in order to build a flat perch of the first coastal carriageway. Materials had to be sliced off the road, thrown into the water, and all of a sudden, hey presto, you have extra land for free. And so they discover by making the carriageway, they discover reclamation. And then the marine lots, which are in front of this, they haven't made a proviso to protect the government's interests, because these wealthier people who get the most expensive lots, which are in front of the Queen's Road, start to realize, well, I can do that too. And they start to excavate and reclaim and sold to them. And that starts to create a tension between the mercantile interests and the government interests, because the government wants to protect the edges of Hong Kong for future growth, because they realize quite early on, the Queen's Road may not be the only edge of the Hong Kong. There may be a next one in front of it. So they have to then create a cordon sanitaire in the water in their heads. Now, I don't write about that, but that is very much a sequence of effect as they're thinking of topographies and terrains. That there's strategies, future strategies that they're thinking about from just a blunt geographic point of view. So yeah, I'll end there.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think that was a really interesting overview of how the restructuring of Hong Kong, while inevitably impressive, also scarred Hong Kong's landscape. So on the topic of alternative histories and the inclusion of the suffering of races other than the Europeans, I'll now turn to Jenny for her question about how the use of paintings may provide different interpretations of Hong Kong's history.
Thank you, Lory, and thank you, Chris, for your introduction, where you showed us numerous exquisite visual and graphical materials that you use in the book. So as comparative literature students, we're very interested in how historians approach artworks. So you mentioned that you want to focus on how these visual materials, they reflect the feeling and experience of living in Hong Kong. For instance, in the earlier part of the book, you pointed out that there is a recurring depiction of Hong Kong's foreboding and hostile barren hills by Western painters, which would suggest a sense of danger for settlers. But your book also features many paintings by the naval surgeon Edward Cree, who is actually an amateur artist. And the collection of his works that you use in your book not only capture the landscape, but also offer a unique glimpse into his personal observation of Hong Kong from his subjective point of view, which often includes a lot of mundane and daily moments. So unlike official archival materials, Cree's paintings serve as his personal records of his life in Hong Kong, adding a distinct and intimate touch to the Western historical narrative of Hong Kong. So we were wondering, how do these rather personal visual artworks complement or potentially critique other sources, such as official government documents, newspaper, and maps? And from the perspective of a historian, could you provide additional insight into how you would approach these artworks as historical objects, and how does the creative agency behind this work provide new perspective on how the interaction between diseases, the spatial, and the people during that era?
That's a good and long question. I'll have to untangle it. Thank you, Jenny. One of the things is that I guess, I'll be honest, one just hoovers up as much as one can find, especially because there's so little in this early stage visually. You just hoover and find what you can, as many sources and people telling you and asking for advice. And so I mean, I basically would say that the government. So if you take government official reports, they're not going to show drawings like this. They're going to show maps and plans and elevations of a building. One of the slides I sent you is Johnson's facade, the facade of Johnson's house, and then the cleverly the facade of the Exchange building by Tama Choi, to compare them to contractors, two Chinese contractors. Those are the kinds of government drawings you'd see in the National Archive at Kew, for example, or the Hong Kong Public Records Office. But these other drawings, as you quite rightly say, offer very strange, different intimacies, different ideas. And the images that you showed up on the screen, do you want to show that again, what you just showed? Those three images I selected are probably the three interior views we have that I showed. There aren't that many interior views of Hong Kong. Now, in the book, I've not arranged it at all like this. They're split apart from each other in their own categories, their own moments in the story. But I showed them in the sort of sequence in which I talk about it, not necessarily chronological sequence, but the sequence in which I talk about it. And you see here on the left, a military officer writing to his mother, and he's just sketching this as a doodle. He's a very gifted drafter. In fact, he's the one who draws the first contour survey of Hong Kong, Collinson, T.B. Thomas Bernard Collinson. And we see here the interior view and the knickknacks and all that. And I read that at the end of my talk. And then we go to another person. All three are different. That's why I chose this. They're three different people. Collinson's a Royal Engineer. Edward Ashworth is an architect, a private architect who's looking for work. And Edward Cree is a sort of a Royal Naval surgeon who's a painter, as an amateur painter on the side. Each of them have different relationships to Hong Kong, different periods in which they're in Hong Kong, different jobs, roles that they take in interrogating Hong Kong. And so out of the way their professional and personal identities are discovered in their work, I'm able to then, or at least try to see how they integrate their opinion on Hong Kong, how Hong Kong speaks to them, and the opportunities in which Hong Kong reveals itself to them, reveals their bias. And so there's a sort of the questions of how do I create a kaleidoscope of bias effectively. And so we have different kinds of ways of seeing Hong Kong. The middle view is a very rare view of a Chinese interior of a wealthy merchant, Chinam, and the Hong is his merchant house near the central market of the Western District. And but I wanted to reveal in this particular image the difference, the junction between traditional Chinese architecture, which is in the main courtyard, with the outer wall, which has got a normal European casement window and a Western style staircase and door below. And so we get to see a kind of hybridity where the Chinese is kept privately by the merchant on the inside, but the Western components, as he sees it, are advertised on the outside for him. And I thought that was a very revealing moment. And of course, with Edward Cree, as I've mentioned, we get a sort of theatricality of vulnerability as explained by Miss Lefoy to him, and his fantastical drawn view of this, which if you look at his other work, which is not published, but if you go to his actual diaries at Greenwich, you'll see it's full of images of Tunka women boating around, and he's very interested in views of it's not just a racialized distinction, it's also a gendered distinction that he has, a bias between women and men that are Chinese. So I think that's very revealing to me. But he's also very interested in the day-to-day workings of people and how they build and how Chinese craftsmen construct and how the city's growing. He's got a view of urbanism as well, and he draws landscapes from his own point of view and as an untrained eye. Edward Ashworth has a trained eye, as does Collinson. The other two are both professional engineers and architects, and so they have a different clinical view. And then there's also George Chinnery. There's one image I show of Chinnery and his view of landscape. He only visited very, very shortly, for a very short period of time there. And we see Greenbank, the garden, with the first botanical garden of Hong Kong in that view. So yeah, I would say, to answer your question, Jenny, these are very much needed views to not just counteract, but also augment the biases of government documents, and how these sort of the government documents, you'd be surprised actually, government documents aren't dry just because they're government documents. They can actually be quite emotional, quite volatile, quite sensational in their own rights. Just as newspapers and diaries can be quite dry, quite unsensational, quite worthy, if you like. So the kind of document doesn't predicate the kinds of content one might find in them. And so I would argue that just using a variety and seeing what comes, that ad hocness, which is difficult for us because we like to theorize. Perhaps we like to theorize too quickly. I would caution, just pause, read, absorb, find, listen. Again, listen, and then see what comes out of that. But that takes time. That's a sort of harder path. And so, yeah, I would argue that that's what I was trying to do with this project. Yeah. Okay, Jenny.
Yes. Thank you for your answer. One thing I really enjoyed when I was reading your book was that you would include all these information about the lives of these painters in Hong Kong. Oh, sorry. One thing I really enjoyed when I was reading your book is that you include these information about the lives of these painters in Hong Kong, and how I think this really shows the richness and the possibility of reading these graphical materials, and how they each offer their own unique viewpoint of looking at that time period and the experience of living in the city. And in addition to artworks and the perspectives they offer, your fascinating approach to exploring the ongoing tension between settlers and nature also provides a unique understanding of Western narratives and decisions regarding the development of Hong Kong. So as an eco-critic, I'm deeply intrigued by how the way you focus on how the settlers were losing and attempting to regain control over nature amidst Hong Kong's urbanization. So the traditional narrative of Hong Kong formation often emphasizes human-related factors such as warfare, commerce, political dynamics, and other elements. But your book, particularly in its early chapters, underscores how the outbreak of diseases is a factor beyond human control, and how the specific causes of these outbreaks are unknown. And the discourse surrounding the unfamiliar natural environment and climate in Hong Kong suggests a sense of danger for settlers. And this perspective reveals how the outbreaks in Hong Kong left the settlers feeling powerless and vulnerable against natural forces upon their arrival. But in later part of the book, you intriguingly pointed out that in the remaking of the city, the affluent merchant classes regarded owning a substantial garden and importing high-quality trees and plants are indispensable as having a comfortable home. And one example you provided and you just mentioned is the Green Bank. Is set in a valley declivity, which was a feared site of sickness. And you underline that this is a botanical experiment to boast that it would banish past fears. So amidst outbreaks of malaria, the close proximity to an ideal natural environment can indeed provide a sense of stability for the people at that time. But this regaining control over nature, the ability to artificially create a safe, comforting, and natural environment around a domestic home is a privilege exclusive to the affluent imperial upper classes. So I was wondering how does botanical imperialism manifest itself here, turning decision related to environmental management into a stage where imperialists display and assert their dominance? Because you also mentioned some of the details about the planting schemes in later decades. So do later planting schemes downplay the oppression of the colonizer and instead emphasize their contribution to environmental aspect? which brings a sense of safety to this barren rock plagued by deadly diseases outbreak? And how can we analyze their environmental management as a microcosm of their imperialistic strategy to assert control over their colonies? Sorry for the long question.
I like it. Well, I mean, it's difficult to untangle this because, first of all, it depends on how you create a taxonomy. Your question has a particular in-baked in taxonomy, and with your permission, I want to break it open because I think this idea of the imperialist narrative is has a lumbering, homogeneous aspect to it, and to be honest, there's no thing called the imperial narrative. There are narratives, and they are competitive narratives and polyvalent. And so I would say, in terms of who is voicing, who is ventriloquizing, or who's performative, who's got this narrative, who's controlling the talking stick. And I would say that there's many people who have competing narratives. So in this respect, if we just take Greenbank, and I have the image, I can share it if you want me to. Shall I share it with everyone, the Greenbank? Let me just do it while we're talking. Share the image. Okay, let's zoom down. If I've got it, hopefully I've got it. Maybe I don't. I've got loads of images. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to share this image so everyone can see that. There's Greenbank. Can anyone see that? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, great. So what we see here, two views of maps of Greenbank. Edward Cree's drawing on the left, 1844, and the plan much later of this declivity, which is Lan Kwai Fong, basically. So where modern Lan Kwai Fong is, this is where the first botanical garden was, and it's a private garden by Dent & Co., which was the second wealthiest merchant on the island after Jardine Matheson. Well, there's argument they could have been equally wealthy, but Dent & Co., of course, collapses in the 1860s by a mistake, a fatal mistake in terms of a market crash, which they don't get the news in time. Jardine, apparently, legendarily, Jardine Matheson's ship is quicker to get news to them. But Dent & Co. were a major Hong at this point, an opium trader, and they bought this house on the left, built by William Kane, who was the first real European inhabitant on the island, who built the magistracy, the prison, which we now have as the Arts Exhibition Centre, and he left this building and gave it to Dent & Co. And it's almost as if it was like a chrysalis. They built the garden around this house, and it became a sort of folly-like bungalow thing. And it's very interesting that this first house was so opulent of Hong Kong. It was first European house. It was like a Chinese pagoda form, it's truncated. And they built their house, Greenbank, the house itself, as you see here on this marker. That little house pavilion is there, which you see in this picture. That's the path walking that way. And then it's a meandering path climbing, and it climbs up to this podium deck. And this is Greenbank proper. Mr. Brain, who was a partner of Dent & Co., owned the house. And he got Robert Fortune, the famous botanist, who infamously stole the tea bushes from China and tried to propagate them, failed actually in India. But he was a frequent visitor to Hong Kong in the early days and would advise the government on which plants to grow. And his rule of thumb was, if you find it there growing naturally, that's the tree to grow, which I think is actually wise advice. But as you can see from the hillside on Cree's drawing, it's completely bare. And so we get this sort of idea of that the botanical gardens that later get built on the Cantonment Hill area was developed from a private interest group. So in terms of a sort of imperial relationship, we have here a private company, which is pan-imperial, you could say, because many of the advisors of these Hong merchants were Chinese compradors, very wealthy compradors. You could say that the compradoric system were the seeds of Chinese benevolence to the Chinese community in Hong Kong initially, as well as Chinese contractors like Tama Tsoi, a great patron of the Chinese community. So we have the compradoric system advising too, hidden behind this narrative, but it's there, advising what to plant, who to bring in, which laborers to work for them. They have their rich merchants have their own advised preferred contractors to work for them, and so forth. And so we see with Jardine Matheson have even their own architect. They hire their own architects. So a European, they can afford European. So we have here a certain little hybrid experiment that Robert Fortune singles out in the colony as the great inspirational seed from which the rest of Hong Kong can develop. But he's ignored, and that advice to reforest Hong Kong doesn't really get taken up until a bit later. But nevertheless, it still haunts them that afforestation would be the way to cure the malarial effects. And as I say in the book, rather cheekily, they build in this declivity, which is considered miasmatic, as if you like, thumbing their nose and saying, well, no, this is how we can survive. This is how we can grow. And we're now seeing this idea of a botanical garden in this age of new confidence, as they're starting to rebuild Hong Kong and thinking, well, they can overcome it by their own activities. So as I said in the introduction, the book is like a story of two halves. It's one of collapse and one of return, not necessarily for the better for all parties, but nevertheless, it's an idea that within the perceived destruction of Hong Kong lay the clues for their reinvigoration. And so, in a way, part of this reinvigoration is this idea of how can we grow plants on the sides of Hong Kong? How can we protect their growth from being cut away again? As to the long-term question of imperial control of Hong Kong, again, I think it's a difficult one for me to answer, because that's a monolithic conception, and I don't think like that. I think in terms of different players from what they say and different interest groups, and sometimes they align, sometimes they divide. You can find later that there were many elite Chinese elites who allied themselves often with government interests against their own communities. And so we have, it's a complicated set of relationships. But I think that the afforestation of Hong Kong, and I think Robert Peckham's written a good essay on this for Modern Asian Studies, talks about how the politics of space alters as the government starts to reforest Hong Kong. And the key question is also, how do we prevent this new growth from being cut away again? Because the British blame the Chinese for stripping the island bare, and that becomes a sort of narrative. But of course, a lot of the Chinese are disenfranchised by the British as they start taking control of parcels of land, and they're forced to cut down, as I mentioned, low-lying vegetation, to sell to ships, to smoke out the hulls, to kill off wood-boring insects and other things. So there's real survival reasons why the Chinese are forced to strip the land for their own survival needs. And so it's a complicated issue. But anyway, I'll stop the share, and there we go. All right,
Yeah.
Jenny.
There's a last question, and about perspective to understanding Hong Kong in case of the British Empire as a whole. And I will pass it to Lory here.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. So Chris, your narrative looks at the rapid construction of sturdier and well-ventilated buildings in Hong Kong from 1844 to 1846, a period of intense construction triggered by the 1843 malaria epidemic. Your book also provides lots of evidence of tourist residents and even Imperial Commissioner Ying's praise of the newly constructed buildings. Yet you also point out that there were a few criticisms which described the poor state of roads and public buildings. So my question is this: do you think anecdotes like these, which detail Hong Kong's rapid modernization, while criticisms about the period were sidelined, make Hong Kong seem like an exceptional case to other colonies in the British Empire, as is often believed to be the case by many? Or do you consider Hong Kong to be more demonstrative of other cities?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, because are you saying that, in what way do you think I think that Hong Kong is unique in that respect? I mean, the anecdotal, you saying it's that the anecdotal evidence needs more to suggest one way or the other, or I don't fully understand. Sorry.
Sorry, I should have been clear. Yeah, I'm just curious as to whether, this anecdotal evidence of people praising Hong Kong's newly constructed buildings and this new landscape, did it perhaps lead to this mistaken fallacy of Hong Kong as extremely modern? And yeah, did it lead to this mistaken belief, basically, which kind of carried on throughout the plague and even today?
Oh, right. Yeah. Interesting. So I want to push back slightly on the phrase anecdotal, because it might be that one person's anecdotal is another person's evidence. And I would say that everything's anecdotal in a way. I mean, what is anecdotal? Because, I'm finding materials from all sorts of different directions. And I actually necessarily don't trust government sources more because they're government sources than I trust some Chinese poet off a boat looking back at the island, which I quote on, right? As I think through a translator. Is that any less viable as evidence, right? And I would say that it brings to a very interesting question, actually, a question within the question, which is, how does one weigh evidence, right? How does one actually say which evidence is more secure than others, right? And I would say that it's sort of like I hesitate to make that judgment myself, but rather I like to collect these together and in juxtapose reveal something. So perhaps there may be an underlying tension with something. And if another correspondent says something from a different vantage point that seems to reinforce it, it does suggest that there is something there, right? So I don't necessarily consider things as anecdotal at all, but rather I think that it's a different mode of evidence. And therefore, just to be technical, going into the weeds of it, but I think that that it just offers another illuminating layer, a strand that we can play with. And so it's just weaving it together. In terms of this idea of a uniqueness of Hong Kong, this idea of Hong Kong, I wasn't actually that aware that narrative was there, that Hong Kong was this sort of beacon of progress in the 19th century and everyone has to look to it. Because I actually think that Hong Kong has periods of image of progress and periods of decline regularly in its long journey. And I don't necessarily think Hong Kong was treated as a disaster for sure in the 1840s, as an embarrassment, and from various state actors and non-government actors, and you can see that in the book. What I allude to in the end of the book is the great California gold rush. By the early 1850s, Hong Kong is booming because the population is rapidly growing, particularly the Chinese population, enormous influx of people. And so the urge to build and expand the city is enormous. But of course, many of the Chinese living in effectively ghettos and shanty towns and really impoverished living. And we've been talking about Taiping San, but that was the good stuff. That was the actual formed built stuff. There's lots of stuff not visible on maps, including a survey maps by the Edwards de Havilland map that I showed you, the survey, the pullout map, which I mentioned. There's an awful lot of mat sheds, structures that are all across that surface of land and is completely not shown on that survey, a hidden urbanism that we're not aware of. So in terms of the idea of a Hong Kong's imageability at that point, I think that it picks up by the 1850s, really. And of course, as you say, it does have a sort of powerful image by the 1870s as this gateway of Western civilization on the edges of an unexplored China, you could say, with John Thompson's, the photographer, viewing it that way. But we also have a Shanghai competing by then, doing very well as an image of a city, an image of Western interest. And of course, Shanghai and Hong Kong become competitors at distance, with people, populations moving back and forth between them, as you know. So we have Shanghainese coming back in the 1950s and 60s to Hong Kong, with the Wong movies showing this. But we know that many of these Shanghainese were themselves from Hong Kong distantly before that. So we have iterations of movement between these polities of space. And so, no, I don't think Hong Kong necessarily was treated as a beacon and a marvelous city at all, at least at this point, but had its waning and waxing fortunes subsequently. But I don't think singled out in any particular way necessarily compared to other colonies along the China coast.
Thank you for your answer, Chris. I think it shows your very nuanced understanding about Hong Kong history.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is a fantastic conversation, and I interrupted only to invite others to join in. And I think continue the kind of questions that Lory and Jenny have brought up, continue the kind of responses to these beautiful answers that Dr. Cowell has given us. I'll go ahead and read one from the chat just to start off. This is from Bobby Tam. He writes, "Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for the very informative talk. Apart from the visual materials, are there any literary sources available in reflecting on early colonial attitudes and on the early colonial attitude and impression of the landscape? I find the poetry collection of William Mercer fascinating in reflecting the early colonial attitude and perception. Could Dr. Cowell kindly suggest any other relevant literary sources that exemplify the early colonial imagination of Hong Kong?" And just real quickly, the kind of housekeeping task. If you have a question, please ask it. You're welcome to either chat it here. I'm happy to read it aloud. Or if you want to use the reactions button to raise your hand, then I'll call on you, and you can turn on your mic, turn on the camera, and ask it yourself. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Daniel. I think that that's a very I'm not a literary scholar, and there may well, I don't know who this William Mercer is, so I'd love to know more. But I will say that I am fascinated by literature, but doggerel literature, not necessarily the fine, beautiful literature, but like literature from all sorts of anonymous people writing and creating texts and images of the space. And in fact, I've written a paper on this for a book chapter on a fantastical, and it's in the book as well, of a fascinating travelogue called Hong Kong and the Hong Kongians. And I go to great length talking about this in the second chapter of the book. And it was serialized in 2 parts between 1841 and 42. So we think it's the very first travelogue in existence of Hong Kong. Now, the mysterious thing is we don't know who the author is, and it's claimed to be an excerpt for a book, but we don't even know where the book is. At least I haven't found the book. If someone does find it, please do let me know. But this Hong Kong Hong Kongians is, as I've tried to prove in an essay I've written separately, an amalgam of other literary tropes from other sources, including Charles Dickens' journey to New York, and including William Alexander's studies of Chinese in the 1780s, 90s, where literally, this writer copies a phraseology of a fisherman and his daughter and his wife, and the daughter's feeding food through chopsticks into his mouth, and how he looks and how he's described. And this writer just lifts things and puts them together like a sort of jigsaw puzzle. And I use that as a sort of allegory. So the question is, and the interesting question is, did he ever travel to Hong Kong? Is this a real thing? Is this real? But maybe the more interesting thing is, it doesn't matter if it's real or not. It's actually that it is an analogous to an actual effect that is happening in early Hong Kong, which is this assemblage, a political assemblage, social assemblage, literary assemblage, architectural assemblage, visual assemblage, cartographic assemblage. All of these things have different forms of fictive and factual relationships that it is maybe not important to pass out, because what becomes fictional becomes factual. As cartography starts to form, the maps themselves start to become templates for constructing on them actual roads. So what is drawn and represented and described actually and imagined becomes made. And so that slippage between so-called physical world and the imagined world, I try very hard not to separate, because I find that the imbrication of it is important. I think that the oleaginous, the oily substance of it, how it flows, is important in the story. Thank you.
Thank you. The kind of forgery and the forgery culture of Hong Kong and the early art scene, and along with the plagiaristic culture of the travelogue.
Exactly. Yeah, great.
Fantastic. Adam just provided in the chat, and it sounds like it's a question for clarification to problem with audio. But I think it'd be great to hear it again from you. Do you believe Dr. Cowell mentioned 2 reasons for the deforestation of Hong Kong peaks? The second of them was for the need of wood and the fumigatation of wood boilers in the boats. What was the first reason? This is just to kind of to refresh our memories. You offered 2 reasons for the deforestation of the kind of shipping.
Think back. Well, so for the deforestation, Adam, when the British take Hong Kong in 1841, the northern edge of the island they start building on. Yes, the landscape is, famously it's described as a barren island, right, with hardly a house on it. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's often misquoted. Famously, Palmerston. But this idea of the barren land, the barren island, it's also an excuse of the British to say, I can take it because it's barren. This is the whole imperial narrative. That it's important for the British to justify colonization as being always of a benefit. There's a beneficial aspect to colonization, to justify it in many ways. And one way is to say, well, no one's here. It's all stripped. It's terrible ecology. We are here. We therefore have a divine permission to colonize and take it over, because it's neglected, and the previous patrons have turned this into a trash heap, effectively. So there's a kind of rescue narrative, and the British use this all the time. They use it in India as well, which I work on India too. By the way, my main work is actually India. So we have this kind of idea of abandonment and salvaging and repair and healing, and so in this story we get a narrative of healing running through the document, through the book, where they're fighting against a disease, and of course they have to heal themselves. Doctor, heal thyself, first, and then the doctor's healed and therefore can heal others, can heal this landscape, heal the forest, repair and regrow and all this stuff. So there is a sort of paternalistic narrative, of course, from certain sectors of the community, the European sectors of the community, as they're talking about this, and that hopefully that comes through in the book. But that paternalism, as you say, persists. So yes, Adam, the idea was that it was there deforested, but what I was going to say as the second layer of this was that the British start to expand across and take over areas like Wong Nai Chong, Happy Valley, where the Hakka are living. Kwan Tai Lu is the village that they live in. Petticoat String Road. It's named after a road, elevated high road, and these villagers are accused of stripping the forest, the trees, of denuding the areas around the Wong Nai Chung Gap of trees and forestation. But partly that's because they're being dispossessed by the British as they start to control their other livelihoods, their other spaces and terrains and land for growing vegetables and so forth. I would say these are important things to understand, that the British have to justify their benevolence in order to justify their reason for being there and pursuing expansionist policies.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions? We have a few more minutes before we need to kind of let everybody go have dinner. Presumably let Chris go have his lunch. But we have time for maybe one or two more questions if anyone has one. I mean, I have a quick question. I hope mine. Yes, Ying.
Oh, hi, Dr. Cowell. Thanks so
Hi.
much for the wonderful talk. I just have a very quick, maybe like a naive question in terms of the relationship between human and landscape in the shaping of Hong Kong. So the book title is Form Follows Fever. It seems that Hong Kong, your talk kind of showed how landscape was reconstructed and reimagined after the fever. But I also wonder the role of landscape itself, like kind of in the, like even before the fever kind of, like already predetermined, like how people kind of imagine or use the landscape for the for managing the fever. So yeah, just curious more about like whether Hong Kong's unique geography, it's shaped as a small island location, in the in the sea, kind of influence people's imagination and management of all these kind of disasters in the island.
Well, thank you, Ying. Is it? Thank you, Ying. So let me just. Something's gone dark here. Why don't I share the screen again to help answer that? Hold on a second. Help answer that question, and let's see where we are. I don't know if you can. I can. Don't know if I. The landscape. Let's think about landscape. There's some of the landscape. There's a Chinnery's drawing of Greenbank. I didn't show that one. Let's go back a bit. See where we're at. Oh, by the way, I want to just add to landscape, just to add something. I think it's important to say this. I want to compare these two maps. We see Collinson's contour survey of Hong Kong in 1845 and Belcher in 1841, and notice how the design of a map, in its empirical sense, tends to flatten and tame the landscape of Hong Kong through its cartographic imagination. And just because this is drawn in a very artistic manner without measurement and in a different way, it doesn't mean that this one is better. It is scientifically more measurable, but it loses something in turn, doesn't it? In the way that it tries to explain away something which perhaps is much more viscerally and immediately real and understandable in the other map. And so one of the things is not to just talk about imageability of landscape as progress. And so with Ying's sort of obliquely answering Ying, the before and after of malaria doesn't necessarily mean that something improves, right? It just means that there's a different way of cognating it and understanding it. This is pre-malaria. This is the landscape of the Happy Valley. This is one of the earliest views we have as a drawn view of Happy Valley by Cree. Cree's very, very helpful in this respect. He keeps popping in and out of our chronology at intervals, but he's very involved in like almost like a reportage photographer. He's very quick on the spot drawing, although this painting was drawn from memory sometime later than the event itself. But we see here a very early view of the valley itself from the shoreline inwards. So we're coming from the waterside into the valley. The Wong Nai Chung Gap is up here to Chek Chu eventually and Repulse Bay, but we have here the old village of Quan Tai Lu down here, and then the burial ground is here. So the second necropolis of Hong Kong, where they start to bury the dead here, it becomes a boundary zone of cordon sanitaire. So the city sort of limits its growth to that point. So we see here, I would say that a difference of landscape, to sort of answer Ying in some ways, is that the visibility, Hong Kong is a city of fragments before the malaria, that different bits along its edge are explored, experimented, examined. But after malaria, it starts to consolidate and it collapses, and more the focus is on the urbanism of the city itself. And it becomes a city of two bits, the outer hinterlands, like Happy Valley, and the inner parts of Hong Kong. And whereas at this point, they don't know where they're going to build. And in fact, lots of debate is had as to moving the capital to here and not to keep it where it was accidentally over there. And so that becomes an important thing. And we can see here landscape, imaginary ideas of the tops of hills and the health of hills. I wanted to show, I think I already showed this, these kinds of images, very, very early images before the disease happens. And we get, in particularly from John Collins, who is also a naval artist, painting a very, very clinical view, I would say, of a studied view as he sees it of the land, without perhaps a strong ideological proclivity here compared to, say, some other artists. But that's up to you to decide. But we start to see, he even does a study of the Kowloon on the opposite side. The image is in the book, but there's a Kowloon with the forts on the opposite side. And I would say that one of the conditions of landscape for being on this edge of the island, to answer Ying on another section of a question, is that Hong Kong Island is peculiar, because it was all along the edge of an island, all along a string. It wasn't the whole island, it was the edge. It was bounded by the surface of water, and it was also looking towards a piece of land they couldn't take yet, Kowloon. And Kowloon is a ghostly preeminence. It figures into the way they imagine their planning of Hong Kong Island as well. Kowloon sits there, teasing them, haunting their actions. And so there is an imaginary effect of a landscape they're not on the landscape they are on. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. They're always aware that they're on the edge of something facing something else, of course. And so, and also this belief that they're on the wrong side of the island, because the south is sunny, the north seems to be darker, especially with the heavy, shadowy hills right behind them. And I think that idea of taking the wrong edge and the wrong side and disease and all that feeds into their idea that they chose the shortest stick, and that affects the way they think. And I do want to also emphasize, and it possibly is unique in a colonization narrative of a modern city, is that I think that I don't know any other city where Hong Kong initially was set up as a bargaining chip to be abandoned. So there was a brinkmanship. Hong Kong was taken, but Hong Kong was taken with the view that it would then be swapped. And Chusan, the island Chusan, closer up to Shanghai, was the major island that the British wanted. And there were other bargaining. They wanted to get back into Canton. And so Hong Kong was always a holding thing. It was always a depot. It was always a temporary sense. And so the other aspect of the book and the relationship of landscape and urbanism is, how do we measure the changes, the incremental changes from a temporary holding depot to a city with a long-term viability? And I think malaria is just one thread through this, but there's other geopolitical and sociopolitical, socioeconomic dimensions involved that change that dynamic, that ponderance from abandonment to preservation, and how they see the landscape is part of that political language. So I'll stop the share.
I think we have time for this one last question from Alex Wong. Thank you, Dr. Cowell, for the talk. I was wondering if anything in the early colonial era jumped out as contesting common conceptions of Hong Kong as urban history. I think you might begin to answer this question a little bit in your previous answer just now, but I know you mentioned that the early lullahs got filled up soon later. I was wondering if there were any other examples like that. And this is our final question. So this is thank you, Alex, for thank you very much. Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Alex. When you say anything in the early colonial era, do you mean other than Hong Kong, or just Hong Kong itself? Common conceptions of Hong Kong Island's urban history. The filling up of the nullahs, I think you mean, right? What do you mean by? I have to clarify this question. What do you mean by how a filling up of a nullah might contest common conception? Do you mean that we assume that the land was flat, and then when I mentioned it was undulating, that was something perhaps people didn't appreciate until I emphasized it?
Yeah, Alex, do you want to release it on your camera and your mic and
ask? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I was wondering about how it can sort of allow us to think of Hong Kong's urban history a little bit differently, because you mentioned the nullahs was like, because most people who are working on Hong Kong did not necessarily know about the history of the nullahs, like kind of separating the Hong Kong island into segments because of this history of the malaria. So I was wondering if there were other examples, like mostly on Hong Kong.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much. Nice. So when I said earlier, please pay attention to geography, what I mean is also, we sometimes think that what we have in Hong Kong now is what there always was, and of course that's not the case. That Hong Kong is constantly changing as a landscape, and it's a negotiated thing. There is a landscape negotiation involved always with Hong Kong, and I know other scholars that are working on this right now and looking at the landscape issues of Hong Kong in a dynamic way, where the human aspect is met with the so-called natural non-human aspect. And I think it's important for us to understand what we have, what are the parts that are negotiated with. Another area other than that undulation I might point to is the abandonment of paddy fields, for example. So that image I showed you at the beginning of the talk, which I'll share it with you since we've got just looking at a blank screen. Okay, so you can all see that. Okay. And I can go back, forward, try. Was it there? Maybe it's back. It's back. Hold on, here. Okay, so can you see this, everyone? Yeah, right. So you can see I showed you this image, but one of the things that's interesting hadn't been really done before. In fact, some historians had denied this fact, but I found actual textual evidence by a royal surgeon who'd visited West Point, who actually states that this is sat on abandoned terraces of paddy fields. And so we see here, West Point Barracks is shaped in 3 dominant clusters, if you like. And why? At different heights, because these are 3 separate plateaus that they have to build against. Level ground. In other words, they chose West Point precisely because Chinese had created a landscape for them that was level, that had terracing. They didn't have to do as much cut and fill work. So, and it's also on the strategic bend of the island, so they have good observation. But I believe it's precisely because of the fact they have this. And if you look, the evidence is clear from our modern day maps. We see here 3rd Street, which is the edge of the island, Having one level, we also know that the Pokfulam road carries on here. At another level, the new road that cuts through the site, in fact, built later on the ghostly lines of the abandoned West Point. In fact, West Points, we know from E.J. Eitel, the historian, the shadow lines of the abandoned camp still was visible in the 1890s. And then Hong Kong U is built, and then we see the boundary of Bonham Road on the third level. So in fact, we can say, perhaps, challenge it perhaps, but we can say that the main building, the first podium plateau of Hong Kong U was built upon a paddy field terrace. And so this is sort of a language, a hidden language of Hong Kong that we can reveal from sources, textual, against visual maps, against modern ordnance surveys, combining the three together that reveal clues as to how a geography, a terrain is predetermined. And therefore, this counters this narrative of the so-called blank slate approach, because there was still Chinese living on the north of the island, except not as dense, of course, as on the south. But that's an important one important aspect I wanted to just point out. There are others, but that's one that comes to mind, Alex.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic, what a fantastic way of ending a talk at HKU by giving us a little bit of HKU history as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Cowell. Thank you very much, Jenny and Lory, for some fantastic responses and a great way of establishing this format. Thank you very much for showing up. Thank you very much for being a part of the conversation. Thank you to John and absentia for kicking us off. Thank you very much. I hope to see you at future CSGC events. If you have, if you'd like to be participating in more of those, you can go to our website, which is chgc at wordpress.com. And I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you very much. See you soon. Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Daniel. Thank you for hosting.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jenny and Lory, for your great questions, and everyone else who's contributed. I really appreciate it. Helps me a lot too. Thank you.